Hello, Mark here. Before we begin today's episode, I would just like to quickly take the time to ask all of those who are enjoying the series a favour. If the platform you use to listen to Castings for Ancient Greece has a rating or review system, I would be extremely grateful if you would consider leaving the series a quick review. These ratings and reviews go a long way into helping others discover the show, in turn helping it grow. So if you enjoy the series and can spare a few minutes, I would love to read what you have to say about your experiences with the show. Thanks everyone for your support, and let's get to today's episode. Pericles hurriedly brought back the army from Euboea, and soon afterwards, the Peloponnesians, under the command of Pleistoanax, son of Pausanias, invaded Attica, laying waste to the country as far as Eleusis and Thraea. Then without advancing any further, they returned home, Thucydides. Hello, I'm Mark Selick and welcome back to Castings for Ancient Greece, episode 63, War's End. Well, we are now approaching a conclusion to this first Peloponnesian War. You may be forgiven for thinking that surely we are not in the same war as a few episodes ago. This war began with no formalised declaration that we are aware of, as what we will see with its greater namesake. When reading the sources, one almost feels as though we just stumbled into a state of war without realising the point it occurred. The tension that would lead to this war developing we had seen being part of the decades after the Persian invasions, with Athens' growth in power and influence, and increased Spartan suspicion. As the decades passed, we would see the spheres of influence overlap, raising tensions further. Even though Sparta and Athens would be the main belligerents on either side of this war, with it commonly known as the First Peloponnesian War, while historian Paul Ray would prefer the First Attic War from Sparta's perspective, there were many regions outside of these two that would see the majority of the fighting taking place. Even with all that we have covered so far, we have only seen Athens and Sparta engage one another on the battlefield once so far. Much more of the fighting was taking place between Athens and the allies of Sparta, those regions where Sparta was looking to spread its influence, and Persia, who was completely separate to the Greek conflict. Athens had even resorted to military measures when it came to its own allies in the Delian League, when they sought to leave. Though perhaps it could be argued that without the underlying tensions between Sparta and Athens, the wider fighting, on the Greek mainland at least, would not have been occurring. This then seeing those elements as campaigns in a larger war. Also, another aspect we saw with these campaigns not involving Sparta was that they were looking to undermine Spartan interests in the long run. Another thing we have seen is that Sparta had been quite inactive so far. We saw that they had been campaigning in Boeotia, which led to the first and only battle with Athens. Otherwise, they had been confined to their home region on the Peloponnese. This had seen Athens almost continually engaging in some sort of military operation, whether it be in Boeotia, Thessaly, the Peloponnese, the Aegean, or other lands such as Cyprus and Egypt. This saw that Athens recognised it had overextended itself, and if they were going to deal with all of these challenges ahead, they needed to calm one of the fronts down. This is what then saw us see a 5 years truce agreed to with Sparta, allowing Athens to focus on stabilising their security within the Delian League, and from Persian threats, as they were a greater threat to the foundation of their growth and power. This is where we brought last episode up to, seeing Athens in a position where they had dealt, for now, with the crisis that had been developing in the Aegean. This was also during the period of the 5 years truce with Sparta, and we looked at how Pericles might have been trying to turn that truce into a longer-lasting agreement. Though arguments also come about on how genuine he was in this, given the concessions Sparta would have to make by default in agreeing to the status quo on the mainland. This episode, we are going to first head back to Sparta and see if we can work out what was taking place there during the period of this 5 years truce. This would also mark a point where Sparta would once again become active militarily, though not against Athens just yet, but engaging in what is called the Second Sacred War. We will then see the situation in Boeotia change for Athens, who appears to have been actively campaigning there on and off throughout the entire war. More organised opposition would form, seeing Athens now on the back foot. This would also see the Athenians having to deal with more league members trying to break away from being burdened with paying tribute. Finally, the war would come to a head with the expiry of the 5 years truce and Sparta's invasion of Attica. However, we will look at how the two would avoid engaging in battle and what would lead to the 30 years peace being signed. First, we are going to head back to look at Sparta during the 5 years truce. Like with the previous periods, the dealings with Sparta, we have no real sources to lean on to get a clear picture of what was taking place during this period. though that doesn't mean we can't make inferences from known developments connected to them or just speculate on what may have been taking place. One can imagine that when Sparta learnt of the disaster the Athenians suffered in Egypt, they couldn't but help be excited at this development. Athens had been causing them all sorts of headaches on the Peloponnese, from raiding their own territory, interfering in trade routes and attacking their allies. However, the reality of the situation would have sunk in as time went on. Could Athens' misfortune in Egypt be a sign of Persian resurgence? If Persia made future advancements into the Aegean and mainland Greece with a crippled Athens, could Sparta with the Peloponnesian League defend their homelands? Surely Sparta would have recognised that the naval power of Athens had been a major factor in defeating Xerxes' invasions. A powerless Athens would prove to be a detriment to defending Greek lands as a collective to outside threats. This would have to be a balancing act that Sparta would have to deal with. On one hand, Athens was their main competitor on the Greek mainland, though without their navy and power, the rest of Greece proved to be a softer target. It would appear that Sparta would constantly be adjusting their approach to Athens with these factors in mind, with policy siding from one end to the other, dependent on which factions were prevailing at different times. This consideration appears to be one factor in seeing Sparta agreeing to a truce with Athens for the time being, with the newly returned Chiron in Athens appearing to have helped persuade the sentiment in Sparta to view Persia as a greater threat at this point. Remembering here, Chiron had a good relationship with Sparta and had been favourable of policies in Athens that had aligned with Spartan interests, though other considerations would also entered into the equation based off their own situation at the time. Tanagra had seen the Spartan army suffer quite heavily, even though they had technically won. After this experience, it doesn't appear Sparta was too keen on launching another campaign out of the Peloponnese for the time being. Also, the campaigns the Athenians had been engaged in around the Peloponnese, Boeotia, and the Gulf of Corinth highlighted that even having been defeated at Tanagra, Sparta and their allies were in no real position to counter Athenian moves effectively. I can't but help think that the members of the Peloponnesian League would have put some pressure on Sparta to do something about the situation. If Sparta failed to act and allow these activities to continue, they could very well find some of their members seeing no choice but to make their own terms with Athens. So it would seem this temporary truce of 5 years that was arranged between the two cities would suit both their situations in the immediate future. As we spoke about previously, the formation of this truce appears to have come with conditions both sides needed to follow. One major one seems to have been relinquishing support of key allies. In the case of Sparta, this meant ceasing their involvement with Thebes, while Athens was to stop their assistance of Argos. Although we are not specifically told of these conditions, the lack of Spartan intervention in Boeotia after Tanagra suggests this disconnect with Thebes. While we find both Thucydides and Diodorus giving us information around future engagements, that in Thucydides' accounts has Argos absent from a list of Athenian allies, while Diodorus refers to them as being neutral. With Athenian support, Argos had become more confident and looked to reclaim territory and encroach on areas of Spartan influence. Now though, with Athenian help being withdrawn, and Sparta now free to focus on issues of the Peloponnese, the Spartans would focus on eliminating Argos as a threat. We're unsure if military force was used to achieve their aims with Argos. This seems likely, since territory would need to be taken. Though perhaps all that was needed was a show of force, such as a Spartan army marching into aggrieved territory. Whatever did take place, the result would be a 30 years peace that would be arranged between the two cities. However, we are left in the dark on the terms of this peace. All we find through Thucydides is a passage where he tells us this peace was due to expire when talking of events in 422 BC, which in turn is the main clue that we know of the peace taking place during the 5 years truce with Athens. Another region that we had seen that had given Sparta grief in the past decade was that of Arcadia, to their north. One polis in particular had been acting against Spartan interest. This was Tegea, who we had seen had entered into an alliance of agreement with Argos around the same time that Themistocles had been active in the Peloponnese. This had seen Sparta go to war, or at least fight a battle against Tegea, to help check their growth. This had stabilised the situation in Arcadia for Sparta during that period, though it appears it was during this period of the truce that Sparta was able to bring Tegea back into the Peloponnesian League. It appears that some sort of active campaigning had taken place in Arcadia, where we hear of one direct reference to Tegea by a writer named Polyaenus, some 600 years later in his work Stratagems. The inhabitants of Tegea suspected that their leaders secretly supported the Lacedaemonians. In order to increase this suspicion, When Clendridas ravaged their territory, he scrupulously avoided damaging the estates of their leaders. As a result of these signs of favour from the enemy, the leaders were immediately charged with treason. When they found that the resentment of the people against them was running high, they feared that they would be condemned on this charge. Therefore, the leaders were forced by the false suspicion to become real traitors, and betrayed the city to Clendridas. This Clendridas appears to have been an ephor, or appointed by them, within Sparta, who would lead this campaign. This also showing a rare example in the sources of Sparta's use of strategy pointed out. Although force seems to have been used, the passage stresses Sparta's strategy in dividing Tegean society to undermine their ability to defend against Spartan moves. It seems likely that with the city being open to the Spartans, they would have had some influence on the government and for governing the polis moving forward. This assumption being supported in the fact that after these past rocky relations with Tegea, the polis would, from this point on, be one of Sparta's strongest supporters, even when future troubles would break out in Arcadia. So, with all the trouble that we had seen face the Spartans on the Peloponnese, from their neighbours and the alliances forming between them, to the revolt that had broken out in Messenia, Sparta, during this period, was able to finally give themselves somewhat of a reprieve on the Peloponnese, not having to focus on Athens helping bring this about. Though, with the home territory stabilised, Sparta could now focus on regions further afield again, while the 5 years truce with Athens was also drawing to a close. Now with Sparta and their territories in a more secure position, they would shift their focus to other developments taking place north of the Peloponnese. This would see Sparta becoming involved in what is known as the Second Sacred War. The term Sacred War is generally used for the conflicts that would be centred around the control over the massively important religious site of Delphi. As we have seen throughout the series, Delphi, located in the region of focus, was of great significance to the entire Greek world. Many people, as well as representatives of the city-states, would often consult this site on matters of great importance. We had seen that previous to the Battle of Tanagra, that Sparta had also been engaging in matters around this region, with them coming to the aid of Doris, who were defending against the Phaeacians. It appears that Phocis was in the process of attempting to spread their influence throughout the region, though Sparta put a temporary halt to that. Now though, in 448, Phocis, who were also an ally of Athens, had control of the temple at Delphi. Sparta would once again intervene in the Phaeacians' ambitions and march into the region. They would be successful in expelling the Phaeacians and handing back over control of Delphi to the Delphines. It is unclear if Athens' connection to Phocis saw any motivation for Sparta to intervene. They were still bound by the 5 years truce, but this could be an attempt at targeting Athens without attacking them directly. The historian Paul Ray also takes this idea further, suggesting the campaign could have been part of a larger effort at undermining Athens, who had control over the regions nearby. Ray would write, Lacedaemon's brief foray into central Greece on this occasion may have been intended in part to serve as an encouragement of those in the region hostile to Athens, who were in fact numerous. Now, if this was the case, it would be another example of where Sparta was utilising a more strategic approach to the conflict, beyond just fighting stand-up engagements. They were looking at fighting Athens' influence indirectly, allowing other polis to expend their resources instead of a direct confrontation with Athens. Ray would then finish off his point saying, if so, the expedition was a tremendous success. What he means by this, we will see very shortly as we cover Athens' response to the Spartans' move, and then their experience in the lands of Boeotia, where it appears not all had gone under Athenian control willingly. The response by Athens to Sparta's campaigning into Delphi suggests that the Athenians had viewed their actions as hostile towards themselves, even though they had not been targeted directly. Shortly after the Delphians being returned control of the temple at Delphi, Athens under the command of Pericles would march to Delphi, with the Spartans having already departed the region, and then saw to it that Phocis would regain control over the temples. How long after Sparta's expedition Athens took this action, we are unsure, with accounts suggesting it was the same year or up to 3 years later. We also hear through Plutarch that Athens would be given the privilege by Phocis of consulting the oracle before others, for their assistance in restoring them control over the site. Remember here, the oracle only sat once a month, and there were a great many travellers who would come to consult on matters. Apparently this privilege had been given in response to an inscription they found, where the Delphians had extended the same to Sparta. Thucydides would then tell us that not long after this success in Delphi, the situation in Boeotia would begin to change. We had seen that Athens had campaigned successfully through the region, capturing many towns and cities. A great deal of these captured places were headed by oligarchic governments, where Athens saw to it that democratic systems would be installed in their place. This had seen many of the previous leaders for those towns and cities head off into exile. Now, though, we would hear that these oligarchic exiles began returning into Boeotia and regained control in certain areas. Orchomenus and Chaeronea specifically named. We find no explanation within the sources of why this development came about, though perhaps there is some connection with Sparta's involvement earlier, as Ray had suggested. There had been hints that Athens needed to remain in Boeotia to keep Athenian control there. Perhaps they could not be everywhere at once, and the exiles had been emboldened by Sparta. Athens would respond to this development taking place throughout Boeotia, though we would first hear from Plutarch that Pericles would attempt to stop the general, Peloponnese, from launching an immediate campaign, trying to persuade him in the assembly against it. He would make a now famous remark during the debate, saying that if he would not listen to Pericles, he would not go wrong in waiting for time, the wisest of counsellors. This account by Plutarch has been called into question on how accurate it was, with the argument put forward that exists in his account, so a contrast to Pericles as a wise and calculated man could be made against the rashness of Ptolemades. However, Donald Kagan suggests this is only an issue if we assume all parties in Athens were unwilling to give up Boeotia. He goes on to say that there was probably those who recognised the difficulty and the strain on Athens' resources to control the growing troubles in Boeotia, where hatred of Athenian control was even seeing traditional enemies within Boeotia uniting to challenge Athens. However, whether or not if Pericles had argued against the campaign into Boeotia, it would not prevent it from taking place. We would hear that Ptolemades would march into the region with 1,000 Athenian hoplites, as well as contingents of their allies, though how many of these there were we are not told. The Athenian-led force would make for the cities now controlled by the oligarchs, with us hearing that Chaeronea would be recaptured with the inhabitants being enslaved, and this time a garrison left to control the city. It's not clear if other actions were conducted, but Chaeronea is the only success reported. After the victory here, Ptolemades would then retire back towards Attica. However, they would be attacked by a force of Boeotian exiles. It also appears other regions had also now decided to take a defiant stance towards Athens, as we would hear that the Locrians and Euboeans would also be a part of this force. The main resistance would come from the city of Orchomenus, who would end up catching the marching Athenians at the polis of Coronea. A battle between the two sides would be fought, where you guessed it, we don't have any details on what unfolded, except that Athens would be defeated, and the man leading them, Ptolemades, would be slain in the fighting. The defeat would be great enough that Athens now entered into negotiations with the Boeotian cities. The terms that would be arranged would see the empire Athens had been extending on the mainland shrink back to what it had been prior to Tanagra. Athens agreed to evacuate all their forces from Boeotia in return for those who had been captured during the battle. This would see the Boeotian cities reinstall their own governments, with the exiled oligarchs filling their old roles. It would not only be Boeotia that Athens lost control of, the regions of Phocis and Locris would be cut off by land, now that Boeotia was lost. This in turn would see these regions regain independence, now that Athens was unable to maintain a connection. As we have seen over the past few episodes, Athens had been dominating these regions. Perhaps Sparta may have had something to do with the return of the Boeotian oligarchs, but now, with the shocking defeat in Boeotia and the loss of so much territory, it appears others now also saw that it was the right time to break away from Athens. We had seen that Euboea had supported the Boeotian exiles in their challenge to Athenian control. Now, with the victory and the concessions gained by the Boeotian cities, it appears Euboea saw that they could also gain their independence, so they would break out in rebellion from Athenian control. However, Boeotia was a different kettle of fish for Athens, and they would see that far more effort was put into making sure the island remained under Athenian influence. If you look on a map, Euboea is quite a large island that stretches all along the eastern coasts of Attica and Boeotia, with many cities dotting the island. Euboea was very important economically and strategically to Athens, with a number of the cities contributing substantial amounts to the league's treasury. We had also seen in the early days of the Delian League, the polis of Charistos had been forced into the league due to its strategic importance. The area had proved to have been an excellent launching off point for the Persians during the 490 invasion. So Euboea was one place that Athens did not want to lose control over. It was too important to Athens' security and continued growth. Pericles would lead an army over onto the island and would begin campaigning to bring the cities back under Athenian control. However, not long into this campaign, another polis would take advantage of Athens being tied up in Euboea, this causing an even more immediate concern. Megara had now decided to break away from Athens, this being Athens' main defensive line against threats out of the Peloponnese. In a turn of events, Megara now had its old enemy Corinth assisting it, along with the cities of Sicyon and Epidaurus. Megara and its allies were able to destroy most of the Athenian garrisons in the area before Athens could react. However, Pericles would halt operations in Euboea to deal with the crisis on the isthmus, since Athens was now vulnerable to attack from the Peloponnese. If you have been enjoying the series and thinking of supporting the show, why not head over to the Casting Through Ancient Greece Patreon page. Over there you can extend monthly support to the show, where to show my appreciation I provide members with early access ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, and video series updates, where we run competitions for members. There are also options available that allow members access to fully referenced show scripts, as well as a personal forum where questions are answered monthly via video. By far and away, the most popular supporter tier is the Strategos level, where access to the bonus episodes opens up. In these bonus episodes, we head back to the beginning of the series and explore certain aspects in more detail. Members can also influence what they would like to see covered in these episodes. Currently, we have just finished exploring the Spartan figure of Lycurgus and the Athenian Solon. We will now be turning our attention to some of the early institutions that would define both Sparta and Athens, with us first turning to the Spartan education system of the Agoge. So, if this sounds like something you would be interested in gaining access to, please consider heading to Patreon and supporting the series there. Alternatively, you can visit the Casting Through Ancient Greece website, where you can find other ways to support the show by clicking on the Support the Series button. Thanks everyone for listening to the series, and I hope you're enjoying the journey. This development around Megara taking place was also around the same time that the 5 years truce that had existed between Sparta and Athens expired. While the Athenian army was in the process of travelling back to home territory, Sparta would march over the isthmus and into Attica, where they would begin laying waste to the lands as far as Eleusis and Thraea. These would be the lands that would be the first to suffer the ravages of war from enemies coming out of the Peloponnese. The Spartan army would be led by King Plostyanax, the son of Pausanias, in what appears to be his first campaign as king. At this stage, around 446, he would have still been in his 20s. What was going on in Sparta with regards to their policy with Athens at this stage is hard to know for sure, but it would seem the war party had gathered enough support to commit to operations against Athens once the truce had finished. It also seems that talks had been going on with Megara and Corinth, as well as other cities, to coordinate this advance into Attica, with the knowledge that the truce was due to expire soon. What caused Megara to break away from Athens is hard to know. It could have been down to harsh conditions under Athenian protection, or perhaps Sparta had offered an enticing deal to come back into the Peloponnesian League. Though it shows that we might possibly have another example of Sparta using other means than just military strength to undermine Athens. It appears the Athenian army arrived in the area before the Spartans could advance any further, where it looked as though another showdown between these two powerful city-states was about to take place. Though before any battle would develop, Sparta would not attempt to advance any further or challenge the Athenians. They would turn back and head to Spartan lands. To explain this about turn by Sparta, our sources turn to the most common reason, usually attributed to these changes of proceedings. Plutarch would tell us that Pericles recognised that Plostyanax was a young man and probably leaned heavily on the advice of his advisor, Clendrides, who accompanied him. He would seek to have a private audience with him, where we hear he was able to corrupt Plostyanax with money, seeing that his army would march back home. The thread of this account then continues with Plostyanax and Clendrides would be held to account for leaving Attica without any further action. Corruption would be a major suspicion, seeing Plostyanax fined a large amount of money, while Clendrides would be sentenced to death. Both would flee Sparta, with Plostyanax going into exile in Arcadia, though he would eventually return to Sparta in 427 BC. What is also interesting here is that when Pericles gave the assembly an account of the campaign later, Plutarch would say that 10 talents of silver was listed as necessary expenditure, which the assembly accepted without question. It could well be true that money might have traded hands during the discussions that took place. However, it seems as though there was also more at play that would see that a battle would not develop between Athens and Sparta this time around. One other possible reason, stretching into the realm of the divine, Paul Ray suggests as maybe playing a part, was that in early September of 446, a solar eclipse took place. For the pious Spartans, this could have proved to have been a bad omen, seeing them not wanting to continue the campaign. Though, Ray also mentions that it is strange that none of our ancient sources mention this eclipse. Though moving on to more pragmatic reasons to explain this about turn, perhaps the recently finished long walls had proved to be a deterrent, with the Spartan army laying their eyes on the completed defensive works for the first time. This may have disrupted the Spartan campaigning plans, with the Athenians now in the region and no other realistic way forward, with reasons for an honourable departure now being sought. This then feeds into perhaps the weightiest of the explanations explaining Sparta's departure. Terms were arranged to avoid battle, that were acceptable to both sides. It is not out of the realm of possibility that any combination of these three explanations could have been a factor, but based on what would transpire, it seems likely that talks had taken place and agreements made. What was discussed and arranged here appears to have then formed the basis of what would become to be known as the 30 Years' Peace. Though we will discuss this in a moment, I just want to finish off Athens' campaigning for the year. With a threat from the Peloponnese having been dealt with, Pericles now sought to finish bringing the rest of the cities of Euboea back under control. We would hear that a force of 5,000 would be sent over to complete this task. This time around, Athens was able to accomplish their aims, seeing the cities would once again pay their tribute. Athens would impose their terms on the island, which would see an increase of garrison colonies, while Athens would also take advantage of the situation to take over fertile land around Chalcis for their own use, by expelling the inhabitants. The people occupying this region were seen to be some of the wealthiest on Euboea, so one wonders if this is where the decision to revolt had originated, since most cities operated on an oligarchic system of government. Expelling them from their source of wealth would see that their importance in Euboean politics would diminish. Another Euboean city would also receive harsh treatment, though for a different reason. During the campaign to subdue Euboea, the city of Hestia on the northern coast had captured an Athenian ship and killed all its crew. For this atrocity, Athens would not have the terms arranged on the island extended to the inhabitants of this northern city. They would be expelled, and Athens would instead occupy the region. It's not entirely certain the fate of the people, with some sources saying they were expelled, with others suggesting they were removed from Euboea. Perhaps if Athens was trying to set an example for their actions, it wouldn't be surprising if the inhabitants found their way into the slave trade. So, for the time being, Athens had now stabilised the situation on the mainland. Sparta was no longer a direct threat, while its revolting league members were once again providing funds to the treasury. For the most part, Athens would remain in a fairly secure situation within the Greek mainland for the next decade, before the developments of the Peloponnesian War. However, as we will see, as we continue, there would still be matters in the Aegean that would require Athenian attention. Now though, heading into 445 BC, we would see the conclusion of this often referred to First Peloponnesian War, with what is called the 30 Years' Peace, and it is this peace that we will now turn to look at for the rest of the episode. The 30 Years' Peace would come in the wake of the confrontation in Attica between Athens and Sparta. As we saw, Pericles was able to meet with Plostyanax before the battle between the two could take place. This would then see the Spartans return to the Peloponnese, and hostilities not going any further than Eleusis. We also discussed the reasons for the Spartans about turn, with the talks between Plostyanax and Pericles being a main factor. It would be these talks that would appear to form the basis of what would become the 30 Years' Peace. What was negotiated between the two in the field we are not aware of, but it was obviously enough to see both sides satisfied. While perhaps we can get an idea of what might have been discussed when looking at the formalised peace that would follow it. The 30 Years' Peace would be drafted not long after Sparta's return to the Peloponnese in 446, then it being ratified the next year. However, a copy of the peace does not exist, though parts of it can be pieced together based on reports from different sources. For the peace to work, Sparta would have been looking to have the possessions Athens had gained on the Peloponnese to be given up. This included the Megarian ports of Nicaea and Pergae on the isthmus of Corinth, as well as Troezen and Achaea on the Argos. Although these had helped extend Athens' empire and influence on the mainland, and they would have wanted to keep control of them, the reality was that currently Athens was losing control of these places, even without agreeing to do so. If they wanted to keep them, they would need to fight for them, which would see war continue. Though Athens had recognised the situation and the cost of contesting these regions was no longer feasible. Megara now had a strong backing from a number of the Peloponnesian League members, with Sparta also in the background. The possessions on the Argos were not as strategically important now, with Sparta having made a peace with Argos, and Athens having cut ties with them to make the 5 years truce. So for Athens, giving these up was not as harsh as it might have been a few years earlier, as they appear to be losing them anyway due to current events unfolding as they were. However, one specific location Athens would retain possession of was the city of Naupactus, which had also been acquired during the campaigns in the Corinthian Gulf. One would think this location would have been a sore spot for Sparta, since it is where Athens settled the Helots that had revolted from Sparta. Though being on the opposite shore of the northern Peloponnese and not within Peloponnesian League territory, they probably didn't have the influence to force Athens from here. We also find that the peace would essentially form two power blocks within Greece, as both Athens and Sparta would formally recognise each other's systems of alliances. This would see that no ally of the two were permitted to change sides. Obviously this had taken into account the sovereignty of the ally in question, but was to prevent Athens or Sparta becoming involved in each other's affairs. However, neutral cities were fair game, with them being able to form an alliance with whoever they chose, though a special mention is made of Argos not being bound by the peace, and therefore free to make agreements with Athens. Though, due to the 30 years peace they had in place with Sparta, they were not free to make any moves against Sparta until 421 BC. And finally, there was also a provision in place that would see that any disputes would be submitted for arbitration in an attempt to avoid hostilities that had been common throughout the previous decade. So we find here, both sides had not been in a position to impose their will on the other, with a compromise having to be made for the peace to exist. Athens fortified its possessions in the Peloponnese, with them realising they could only attempt to hold on to them through war. However, this was not a cost they were willing to make, given how the geopolitical situation had developed. Sparta, also having to make some concessions for the peace to work, didn't push for the abandonment of Naupactus, while also formally recognising the Athenian Empire. Then holding this agreement together was the process of arbitration if dispute should arise. Given that both sides were willing to compromise, shows that neither wanted war or were in a position to continue it. Athens had lost control over the territory around Megara, making Attica much more susceptible to attack from the Peloponnese, as demonstrated by Sparta's advance. Having a more permanent agreement in place would also see that Athens would be able to focus more energy into maintaining its established empire in the Aegean, as there were still issues that had to be dealt with, and would continue to require attention. Sparta too looked to avoid battle and an end to the war. The Battle of Tanagra had shown them that battle with Athenian hoplites was costly, even when victorious. Presently, all that would be achieved in making war in Athens would be possibly killing some Athenians in battle and ravaging Attic territory. This was not worth the cost of Spartan manpower, which was a valuable commodity to Spartan society. Plus, the negotiations had taken away some of the reason for Sparta's concerns with Athens. They were now pulling out of areas of Spartan interests, while also recognising their allies, therefore alleviating some of the pressures these allies would have been placing on Sparta to act against Athens. Now though, with this peace having been concluded, we are faced with the questions around what both sides wished to achieve. Were they hoping that a lasting peace would follow, seeing conflict between the two a thing of the past? Or was this peace seen more as a prolonged truce, where both would be able to better prepare themselves for future conflict? Given hindsight and the name of this conflict, the First Peloponnesian War, the second view is often seen as being the correct one to take. The Peloponnesian War, that would develop 15 years later, would often be seen as a continuation of the First Peloponnesian War, with the same suspicions and issues causing conflict to break out. However, it is also possible to see new issues being created through the conditions of the 30 Years' Peace. This tacit agreement forming two separate power blocks would create future points of contention. Perhaps both had the intention of a more stable existence with the signing of the peace, though it leading to future unintended points of contention. This seeing the two Peloponnesian Wars as separate conflicts in the same way that World War II would follow World War I 21 years later, and how the Cold War would develop directly after World War II. This being that the suspicions and issues were not fully resolved in the initial war. The post-war negotiations and settlements were insufficient in satisfying all parties and creating new issues that would lead to another distinct conflict. However, as we continue with developments in the wake of the peace in the next few episodes, we can try and examine more closely how the agreements made during the 30 Years' Peace would impact future interactions and issues, while also seeing how much of an impact the suspicions and concerns present throughout the creation and development of the Dealing League were still playing a role. I can't but help see that we are going to witness a complex mix of both taking place. The agreements made in this formalised peace would allow for new challenges to develop, while both Athens and Sparta would not be able to forget their past history with one another, influencing how they would respond. Thank you everyone for your continued support, and a big shout out to all those who have found some value in the series and have been supporting it on Patreon and other various ways. Your contribution has truly helped me grow the series. I would like to give a personal shout out to a new member over on Patreon, so a big thank you to Peter Richardson for deciding to sign up and support the series over there. I hope you enjoy all the extra episodes. If you have also found some value in the show and wish to support the series, you can head to www.castingthroughancientgreece.com and click on the Support the Series button, where you can discover many ways to extend your support to helping the series grow. Be sure to stay connected and updated on what's happening on the series, and join me over on Facebook or Instagram at Casting Through Ancient Greece, or on Twitter at Casting Greece. And be sure to subscribe to the series over at the Casting Through Ancient Greece website. I hope you can join me next time when we continue the narrative in the series with episode 64, The Samian Revolt.